Chapter 26, the urinary system. Main function is removal of metabolic waste produced by cells. Also important in maintaining certain homeostatic levels like blood concentration of important ions like sodium and potassium. Also important in maintaining blood volume and pressure. Also blood pH, that blood chemistry. And also there's an endocrine function with the production of calcitriol and EPO, erythropoietin. So let's look at the organs. There are the two kidneys, the ureters, which connect the kidneys to the urinary bladder, and then the urethra, through which urine is expelled into the environment. So let's look at the kidneys. They're retroperitoneal, that means they are behind, posterior to the peritoneal lining. Their position is essentially between T12 and L3, the vertebrae, with the right kidney being a bit lower than the left kidney. Here's a posterior view, so the right kidney is inferior, a bit lower than the left kidney, and that's because of the large size of the liver. 3 layers of connective tissue. Outermost, there's the fibrous capsule or the renal capsule. So here's your kidney, and outermost, it should be labeled somewhere, the renal or fibrous capsule, outermost layer. And it is primarily collagen fibers. It's fairly tough. Deeper to that, there's the perinephritic fat or the adipose capsule, which is an adipose layer, which is kind of squeezed in here. And you can see the adipose tissue. And then there's the renal fascia, which is fibrous connective tissue, which is just right on top of the kidney. And it helps anchor the kidney to the surrounding structures. Fibrous connective tissue, the renal fascia. So outermost here, I guess it looks like it's kind of blue or white in color. Okay, so right on the surface of the kidney, the renal or fibrous capsule. Then there's the perinephritic fat surrounding it in yellow. And then outermost would be the renal fascia. So let's look internally, the anatomy of the kidney. It's bean-shaped. If you ever heard of kidney beans, it's because they're kind of shaped like a kidney. About 4 inches long, 1.5 inches thick. The hilum, sometimes called the hilus, this is on the medial surface of the kidney, and it's where blood vessels and nerves enter and where the renal pelvis exits and transitions to the ureter. Outermost, there's the outer renal cortex, here in lighter color. And then innermost, where all this stuff is the renal medulla, the more central core portion. So in the renal medulla, there's 6 to 18 renal pyramids, which we see here in kind of cross-section, and they're cone-shaped structures. At the end of each renal pyramid, the little tip here is the renal papillae. And then from there, as we'll find out, urine leaves the renal pyramids and drops into these little cone-shaped structures, which are called the minor calyces. So one of them is a minor calyx. And then the minor calyces fuse into the major calyces, and there's 2 to 3 of them. And the major calyces fuse into one fairly large renal pelvis, which again exits the kidney and then forms the ureter. A column, this is some cortical tissue that's between and separates the pyramids. So that's in light pink color here, renal columns. So they are between the renal pyramids. And a lobe is one section, including a renal pyramid, some of the columns, and the outermost section of cortex. It's kind of like a wedge-shaped section out of the kidney. So let's look at the blood supply. Kidneys are receiving quite a bit, 20-25% of the cardiac output. Kidneys function to filter blood, so they have an ample blood supply. They receive the blood in from the abdominal aorta, and then branching off of that is the renal artery, here in red, coming into the kidney. And then the renal artery branches into multiple segmental arteries. And then the segmental arteries branch into interlobar arteries. So those are the red arteries here, the blood vessels that go up between the renal pyramids. And then there's the arcuate artery, and that is again, well, that is the arteries that kind of arch over the renal pyramids. Here, arcuate arteries. And then from there, extensions branch out into the cortex, and those are called the cortical radiate arteries. So these are arteries that radiate out into the cortex. And then the little red knobs here, we'll talk about those. Those are glomeruli. Glomerulus is singular. And that's where the filtration to form urine occurs. Leading to the glomerulus are afferent arterioles, which I'll show you in a better picture. They're really small. Then you have the glomerulus, which are capillaries. And then leaving that, you have the efferent arterioles. So afferent means towards the glomerulus. Efferent means exiting or leaving the glomerulus. Then you get the peritubular capillaries, which we don't have shown here, but I will show you them. And they're called peritubular because they're blood capillaries that wrap around the Nephron tubule, which is in purple here. And then the vasa recta, which are capillaries that wrap around the Nephron loop or loop of Henle. And we'll see those in more detail coming up here in a few seconds. So here's the summary of the blood flow in renal arteries, segmental arteries, interlobar arteries, arcuate arteries, cortical radiate arteries, afferent arterioles leading to the glomerulus, then efferent arterioles leaving the glomerulus, peritubular capillaries. These three type of blood vessels are associated with the nephrons. And then you get venous blood out, venules, cortical radiate veins, arcuate veins, interlobar veins, and then straight out to the renal vein exiting. So in terms of the blood coming out via the veins, the nomenclature is very similar, except that there are no segmental veins. Okay, so then here we go, the peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta lead to the cortical radiate vein, which is in blue here. And we'll look at these in more detail soon enough. Cortical radiate vein, then the arcuate vein or veins, interlobar veins, which then would be over here in blue, and then they all merge into one renal vein exiting the kidney at the hilum or hilus. And then that merges, the two renal veins merge with the inferior vena cava, and then blood flow back towards the heart. Again, what we just covered right there. So let's look at the nephron, which is this functional unit of the kidney that produces urine. And each kidney has about 1.25 million nephrons, so they're packed in there, they're small. And that's what you see here in purple. This round structure, which is called the renal corpuscle, and then this convoluted structure, which is a convoluted tubule versus the proximal one, and then the nephron loop, also called the loop of Henle, and then what's referred to as the distal convoluted tubule, and then the collecting duct, which carries urine out at the end of the renal papilla that drops into the minor calyx. Most of the nephrons are cortical nephrons. As you see here, cortical nephron, where the bulk of the nephron is out in the cortex. And then we have about 15% of human nephrons are juxtamedullary nephrons, in the sense that much of the nephron, especially the nephron loop or loop of Henle, is down into the medulla. And the juxtamedullary nephrons are more efficient at producing concentrated urine. That means reabsorbing water from what's called the filtrate and bringing it back into the blood supply. We'll focus on the cortical nephrons. So a nephron is the renal corpuscle and the renal tubule. So the renal corpuscle, as you see here, should be labeled. Renal corpuscle, nice little round structure right here. And the renal tubule, which is the elongated tubule that extends beyond the renal corpuscle. And notice that the renal corpuscle envelops this mass of blood vessels, these capillaries, which is the glomerulus. Leading into the glomerulus is the afferent arteriole, branching into many capillaries, which is called the glomerulus, and then the blood leaving is exiting via the efferent arteriole. And in this structure, the renal corpuscle is where the initial filtration occurs of the blood, and then the filtrate drops into this space, glomerular space, or capsular space. And then as the filtrate works its way through the renal tubule, it gets modified, and then what leaves the renal tubule drops into the collecting duct is then what we call urine. So the renal corpuscle, as I mentioned, includes the glomerulus and this structure that encapsulates it, the glomerular capsule, also called Bowman's capsule. That's what the BC here is. So the renal tubule then again has the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, or loop of Henle, and then the distal convoluted tubule, which we see here, which leads out towards a collecting duct. And the reason this is the proximal collecting convoluted tubule is because it is closer to the glomerular capsule, and then the distal one is further away in the sense that the filtrate first enters into the proximal convoluted tubule, then the nephron loop, and then the distal convoluted tubule, which does come back. The distal convoluted tubule does come back and contacts the renal corpuscle, which you'll learn about more in why in physiology. Okay, so the renal corpuscle here, which is again the glomerulus, including the glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule. So from the glomerulus, solutes and water are filtered into the space here, the capsular space. So this indicated by these greenish arrows, that liquid is called the filtrate, and then that enters into the proximal convoluted tubule. So the afferent arteriole is larger in diameter than the efferent arteriole, and that causes an increase in blood pressure within the glomerular capillaries, and then that pushes the filtrates and water out of the capillaries, out of the bloodstream. So solutes, metabolic wastes. And what exits the glomerulus is essentially just the red blood cells and large blood proteins. So glomerular filtration, solutes and water from the blood plasma are filtered into the capsular space. Process is called filtration or glomerular filtration. And then the red blood cells and large molecules and proteins are retained in the blood supply. This is a non-selective process in the sense that the materials that exit the blood supply and go into the filtrate are just things that are small enough to exit the capillaries, and we'll talk about that more in a few minutes.